morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining me here in Season 5-ish of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. If you're here for what to think, you've come to the wrong place. I'll give you my view on current events, politics, science, religion, and whatever else from a logical, most importantly, a Christian worldview. But this is more about how to think. Don't just accept what you're told, ask questions and dig deep. Links for the material are in the notes if you'd like to follow along, and with that, let's go be logical Christians. Well, it's another day. Hope springs eternal. If you're just now waking up, well, good morning, sunshine. If you've been up for a while, good day, sunshine. You've got this. I believe in you. Today will be yet another day in a long, unending string of days in your life where you will take the bull by the horns. You'll be all that you can be. You'll just do it and have it your way. You're the boss, the head honcho, the big cheese. Don't you just love waking up every morning knowing that everything is going to go your way, that you are the master of your own density, and that you're in complete control? Yeah, I have no idea what that means either. Do you identify with me where many, if not most days, you just kind of feel like you're hanging on for dear life? You're the kid on the merry-go-round who started by shouting faster, faster, and now you're just gripping one of those really slippery bars for all you're worth, hoping it stops before you die? Do you feel like you're burning your candle at all three ends? Then you realize you don't even have a candle, and what the heck is it that's burning now? If there's one thing we all desire, as humans, it's control. Maybe control of our own life, control over our kids, control at work. Our desire differs, but the desire is the same. Here's my best advice. Good luck. On today's episode, first we'll try to figure out who did a murder, and then we'll read it, but we won't be happy about it. So grab your magnifying glass and your walking shoes, and then cross your arms and hold your breath, because, well, would you look at that? Would you just look at that? Here we go. Well, hi, murderer. Look, we've been through this before. I don't know why we have to keep having this conversation. What are you, one of my kids? Look, I talk and talk and talk and talk and talk until I'm blue in the face and short of breath, and with the pain radiating from my jaw down the left side, weakness in the left arm, and you just won't listen. And thinking about it, maybe I should stop talking and go see someone about those symptoms, but it'll probably be fine. Seriously, don't ignore symptoms of something potentially bad. Get that mess checked out. That's your PSA for the day. Anyway, down to brass tacks. You're a filthy murderer, and I do mean filthy. Your hands are not only stained red with the blood of tens of thousands of people per year, they are also covered with, quote, mostly nitrogen, water vapor, and carbon dioxide, with smaller amounts of carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, particulate matter, and trace pollutants like sulfur dioxide and formaldehyde. Yeah, see, found on theguardian.com headline, 5 Americans die every hour from toxic vehicle emissions, study finds. And you horrible, terrible, no-good person, you just want to use your internal combustion engined vehicle, sucking down gasoline or diesel, spewing your death gas throughout the atmosphere, murdering exactly 43,830 Americans per year, which is 5 Americans per hour times 24 hours per day times 365.25 days per year. We want to factor in leap year. Now, personally, I don't condone murder. As the good book says in Exodus 20, verse 13, New International Version, and I quote, "You shall not murder." Yes, yeah, didn't think of that, did you? Leadfoot. That's why I have a fleet, I tells you, of Teslas, Tesla, Rivians, Polestars, Lucids, electric Hummers, F-150s, Silverados, Jeeps, Bolts, Volts, and Leafs. You're not going to pin murder, death, kills on me. Now, as we know, we've been told for quite some time now, fully electric plug-in vehicles are zero emission, and don't you dare try to expand the boundaries of that claim any farther out than just tightly around the car itself, only while driving. I just shan't hear about the alleged emissions used to manufacture and transport the vehicle or the parts, assemble the vehicle and get it to the point of sale, disposing of or recycling the vehicle at the end of its life. Nor do I want to hear about the emissions allegedly produced in order to create the electricity needed to charge the vehicles. I just shan't hear it. Zero emission. I thank you. So to try to win you over to the electric vehicle camp, definitely where I reside, despite the vile rumors about me to the contrary you may have heard from such places as this very podcast, let's go through this article so that you can fully and completely understand just how awful and bloodthirsty of a person you are. Sound good? You bet it does. So look, a new study came out using, I'm assuming, the latest available data, they say from 2024, that showed that 41,800 people died prematurely in the United States, attributable to road pollution. So, first of all, excuse me, but their math isn't mathing. I mean, quite obviously, that does not equate to 5 people per hour. That number works out to 4.7. 6842345425551 if I round people per hour, which means that every single hour, not only do we have 4 people who die, we have a person who is just slightly over 3/4 of the way to dead, only nearly dead, having to wait to fully die until the clock, rolls over into the next hour. Now, it's not just murder, it's a drawn-out, brutal death for this one person per hour, except for every, 4 hours-ish when the clock and the deaths kind of match up perfectly. Continuing on, the article quotes Paul Jones III, probably my favorite Paul Jones of all of the Paul Joneses as saying, quote, transportation emissions have real, everyday impacts on the health and safety of communities we live in and represent. Now, who is Paul Jones III, you may ask? And I'm just kidding, you're not actually asking that. I think we all know who Mr. the Third is. But to humor the idea that there could potentially be a living human being who found his or her way to this podcast who doesn't know who Paul is, well, he's, quote, the transportation planner at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. And to continue playing your game, the, quote, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, as if you didn't already know, is, quote, a network of grassroots community-based groups. Now, these are people who actually care enough to review this new study in order to glean all the wisdom therein contained, in order to break it down for mouth breathers like you. Not me so much, just like you. So the International Council of Clean Transportation, or the ICCT, to you and I, in collaboration with the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, or the FIA Foundation, which is clearly not based in the United States, which means they likely really hate the United States, because that's the kind of thing that's, it's the in thing to do these days. Well, these two groups, quote, quantify the emissions from producing and consuming fuel for auto vehicles using measurements collected via sensors, and then calculated the health impacts of that pollution using methods established by scholars. Now, you may ask who these scholars are. And The Guardian, in anticipation of your skepticism, added a link to those words, which, when clicked upon, as one does with links, takes us to pubmed.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov, which is a ridiculous web address. Let's be very honest here. Now, it takes us specifically to an article entitled Global Burden of Disease from Environmental Factors. The abstract of the study is worth reading. Quote, estimation of the disease burden attributable to environmental factors is a powerful tool for prioritizing environmental and pollution management and public health actions around the world. The World Health Organization, WHO, began estimating the environmental disease burden in 2000, which has formed the basis for the modern estimation approach conducted in the Global Burden of Disease, Injuries, and Risk Factor Study. In 2021, environmental and occupational risk factors in the GBD were responsible for 18.9%, or 12.8 million, of global deaths and 14.4% of all disability-adjusted life years, or DALYS, dailies, led by ambient PM sub 2.5 air pollution, 4.2% dailies, 4.7 million deaths, and household air pollution from the use of solid fuels for cooking, 3.9% dailies, 3.1 million deaths. Climate change exacerbates many environmental hazards, leading to increased disease burdens from heat, air pollution, vector-borne diseases, storms and flooding. Other environmental risk exposures and environmental noise pollution also significantly contribute to disease burden in many countries, though more efforts are needed to generate and integrate data resources for inclusion in global estimations. So there you go, scholars and stuff. But who exactly are the ICCT and the FIA? Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on them because they're useless, but in short, the ICCT is the International Council on Clean Transportation. They have a vision for 2050 stating, quote, "We have less than 15 years to cut global CO2 emissions in half and 30 years to get to net zero if we want any chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what this tells you is that they don't understand basic science. See, net zero is a pipe dream. We'll never balance our carbon dioxide, and we don't want to. Logically, the devastation on all plant life, trees, flowers, food, would be unfathomable. The mass starvation would be horrifying. We currently have a greener planet than we've had for millennia. And that's because plants, as it turns out, love CO2. I mean, who knew? Well, middle school age children, that's who knew. They all knew that. We learned this in elementary science, basically. But the point in all this is to ensure the planet doesn't warm by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And again, well, that's logically stupid. The apocalyptic predictions based on a slight temperature rise, a temperature this planet has been before and will be again, despite anything we do, are unquestionably stupid. But we need to go farther back than that. See, I'm a reliability engineer. Root cause analysis is one of my bags, baby. Now you keep asking why until you can't go any farther. So, working backwards some more, not one climate prediction has ever come true. They've all been wrong. In fact, in nearly every case, the prediction hasn't only been wrong, the literal opposite of the predicted event has happened. Working back farther, to think that man has the ability to fix the planet, to think that we have power to break the planet, is the epitome of arrogance. And if you throw an omnipotent sovereign God into the mix, to think that we have any power is asinine. But when enough money, psychological manipulation, indoctrination, and fears mix together, you get functionally retarded organizations like the ICCT. Don't worry, though. I mean, for as stupid and useless as you may think they are, they also have a statement on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So they're one letter better than DEI. They're JEDI. Jedi. How clever. They state, quote, "The ICCT's mission is to eliminate the transportation sector's climate and health impacts. That requires transitioning to clean transportation systems around the world by bringing people together around the right policies and solutions." Probably pretty good so far. Enacting the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion helps us do that. And I have to ask, how? How does Jedi help anyone do anything? And how did we get where we are today as a country knowing that neither DEI nor Jedi was in place 250 years ago? And in fact, it wasn't in place like they've turned it into today, even 10 years ago. But suddenly that is the magic key to everything. And no, it's literally not. DEI or Jedi does nothing to lead to success. That simply checks a box, placing unqualified people in positions of power because of the color of their skin, the genitalia they have in their pants, or their gender identity. What does lead to success is putting the best people in positions of strength to all contribute to the best whatever possible. And whether that means a left-handed black as night transgender Muslim midget or a despicable middle-aged white male Christian, who freaking cares? And the answer is the ICCT. They care because, again, they're stupid. So what about the FIA Foundation? The FIA, as I mentioned, stands for the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. And the fact that that's a French name should make you instantly despise them. Well, they were established in 1904 and, quote, initially embarked on a mission to establish consistent governance and safety standards in the realm of motorsport. Good. They've since morphed over the years, quote, to ensure safe, sustainable, affordable, and accessible mobility for all global road users, and is actively engaged in global advocacy initiatives. In motorsport, the FIA guarantees that events held worldwide adhere to equitable, well-regulated, and above all, safe standards. Did you catch the buzzword? Sustainable, accessible, global advocacy, equitable. Yeah, I mean, they're not interested in motorsport at all. That's no longer their focus. Since 2022, they've produced an annual sustainability report. And that brings us back around to the idea that we have to get rid of that pesky CO2. In 2024, they decided to expand that sustainability report and add in a nice little diversity and inclusion section as well. So why does it matter that these organizations delve into the world of DEI, JEDI, and sustainability? Well, simply put, because they can't be honest brokers of data. You can't trade your logic and reason for agenda and advocacy. You can't suspend actual science, replacing it with agenda-driven quasi-science, and expect to be able to honestly and impartially collect and analyze data, draw conclusions, and generate recommendations. Much like many of our organizations and institutions these days, they simply just can't be trusted, at least not blindly. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. The article goes on to state that polls say that an increasing number of Americans are, quote, concerned about exposure to environmental toxins and would support more stringent regulations from federal officials. Note that it doesn't say a majority or even a plurality, just an increasing number. Well, if I go from 1% to 1.1%, that is an increasing number. But don't worry, they have more embedded links. One of them links to an article from May of 2026 from the Kaiser Family Foundation that says that MAHA-based voters, Make America Healthy Again, they're concerned about, quote, health. But that general concern lags behind their concern over healthcare costs. Okay. Their other link, hopefully more promising, links to an article from November 2024 from the Environmental Protection Network, so you know it's good, saying that after the election in 2024, quote, voters overwhelmingly support a strong EPA to protect public health. Their claim is that support for expanding the powers, or at least keeping the powers the same for the EPA, has increased over the last 7 years. And although looking at their alleged sample population, I just kind of bet that closer scrutiny would reveal massive statistical errors in the methodology used by an obviously biased organization like this. I don't know for sure. I just have a feeling. Anyway, the links don't really tell us much, to be honest. So, Lingji Jin, a senior researcher with the ICCT, said that at a time like this, when, quote, many Americans are worried about their and their family's health due to environmental toxins, we simply can't overlook vehicular pollution, quote, on mortality and respiratory health outcomes. Now we, the United States, per the results of this research, have, quote, more new pediatric asthma cases attributable to vehicle pollution annually than any other country. In 2024, U.S. children accounted for 1 in 10 new pediatric asthma cases attributable to vehicle pollution globally. And I have to ask, China? Nothing? No? So when you look up the number of vehicles per capita, per the Wikipedias, of course, we find that the United States has the second most number of cars of any country at approximately 260 million cars. China comes in at number 1 with 469 million cars, nearly double that of the United States. But because they have such a large population with big cities and A higher rate of poverty, they come in at 331 vehicles per 1,000 people, while the United States has 779 per 1,000. But we're by far not the largest. San Marino has 1,606 vehicles per 1,000. They top the list. Malaysia has 1,102 per 1,000 people. Taiwan has 999. New Zealand has 817. And the United States is virtually tied with Brunei, Australia, Guam, and Liechtenstein. Interesting side note, North Korea has 1.1 vehicles per 1,000 people. That's the worst of the worst. Go communism. Back to the point, why is it always the United States that gets beaten about the head and shoulders about this kind of garbage and not other countries that are clearly worse than we are, per their standards? I mean, China is easily the largest polluter. Why aren't they inundated with greenies and Karens? I know that this study is focused on the United States, but surely they care most about the planet, so they'd want to badger China about this kind of thing too, right? But no, that's not right at all. They know that China doesn't care about their precious greenhouse gases. China cares about China. They laugh at 40,000 people killed in a year. Communism kills way more than that every year. But our author of this article, Darna Noor, spelled Dharna, noted as a, quote, fossil fuels and climate reporter for The Guardian, a young, maybe Indian woman who looks exactly like you picture her to look, has the answer for all of us. Thank goodness. She tells us, per the authors of the study, how to stop murdering people. As if you care. And the solution is remarkably simple. All we need to do is accelerate moving to zero-emission vehicles. Exactly as I have absolutely done. And no, I don't need to give you proof. And frankly, I resent the insinuation. In fact, if we only got to 100% EVs, cars, trucks, and buses by 2040, we, quote, could avert more than 100,000 premature deaths and prevent more than 42,000 children from developing asthma by 2050, compared with the currently expected rate of adoption of asthma. Oh, can't someone think of the children? You're not going to do it, though, are you? Unfortunately for the children, Trump. Yeah, see, we're not marching forward toward non-murder. No. We're going the other direction, toward more murder, apparently. Trump is rolling back environmental regulations. He's ignored the settled science of climate change and literally is revoking plans to push EVs on all of us. I mean, all of you, as I've totally already done this. Mouth breathers, that's who you are. And for some reason you don't want to trade in your perfectly fine, generally reliable, fill up at any of a bazillion locations in under 5 minutes, internal combustion, child-killing machines for environmentally friendly, totally cool, silent except for that really, really annoying electric motor whine. Definitely won't light on fire and burn your house down. Uber affordable, practically free to charge. Charge up at any of about a dozen locations around the universe. EVs. The heck is wrong with you? Why won't you do that? The author wraps up her well-written, totally fact-based, unbiased, just trying to save the life of one child article with this, quote, the analysis is the latest in a long line of expert advisories about the dangers of toxic air. Nearly half of Americans breathe in dangerous levels of airborne emissions. The American Lung Association found last year a rise compared with 1 year earlier. Then The Guardian tags on their boilerplate blurb, begging for money. It says, quote, according to a leading global watchdog, American democracy is now more imperiled than at any point since the 1960s, marked by a precipitous decline in press freedom, driven by mounting pressure from the Trump administration in the form of threats, criminal investigations, politicized regulation, frivolous lawsuits, and for the public media, catastrophic funding cuts. Meanwhile, organizations that are supposed to be independent, like the FBI and the FCC, our radio and television regulator, have also been targeting press freedom under Trump-aligned leadership, with the FBI raiding a reporter's home and the FCC threatening ABC's TV licenses after Jimmy Kimmel made a joke about Melania Trump. Yeah. They go on to complain about the mainstream media, who are apparently appeasing the president. You know, President Orange Man Bad, President Nazi, President Oligarch, president lying about assassination attempts, and who knew that they were appeasing. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. But you're still not convinced, are you? You still want children to die in the gas chamber, otherwise known as the earth, that you've created by all your driving to work and to church and school and to go buy groceries and take vacations and the like the cold-blooded murderer you are. Well, at least California is taking this threat seriously. They may not be able to change federal policy, but they sure the heck can try to save the planet, and the children, of course, through enacting their own policies. They got a couple just super policy ideas, I think you'll agree. Let's start with the idea that's most likely to pass, and pass in probably multiple states over a short period of time, the so very popular mileage tax. Now, currently, you can drive your car as much as you'd like, as long as you want to and can pay for gas, including both the state and federal gas taxes. You pay property taxes as long as you do that, which is a total scam, having to pay taxes on something you paid taxes on when you bought it and now you own it, except you have to keep paying for it forever. And as long as you keep your registration current, inspections current, if your state mandates them like mine does, etc., you can drive all over the nation without a care in the world. But here's the problem. The gas tax, specifically the state gas tax, is supposed to be used by the states to keep up with infrastructure like road and bridge repair. Remember how President Potato was pushing to have like 50% of all new cars sold in the U.S. be fully plug-in electric or something like that? Because that'll save the planet that's always only 10 years away from total destruction. Well, one thing EVs don't need is gas. If you don't pay for gas, you don't pay the gas tax, and the government needs your tax money to exist. Well, in order to claw that money back, that money they think they're owed, they need to come up with a new way to tax us. So California is exploring the idea of getting rid of the gas tax because they promise they'll never double tax anyone. And if a leftist politician in California says it, you know you can totally believe it. And they'll replace it with a tax for every single mile you drive. Now look. Here's where I fall on this topic. If I use the base assumption that the gas tax isn't going anywhere, I propose that we leave the state gas tax in place for those driving internal combustion vehicles. But for those driving EVs, we absolutely should be charging them per mile. In fact, I think parking garages should charge higher fees for EVs. They should pay more for parking, etc., because not because I'm embittered. It's not that, which I probably am, a little jaded, whatever. But no, it's because they literally cause a higher amount of wear, tear, and damage to roads, bridges, and other driving and parking structures due to their massive weight. The fairest way to do this is to charge them a rate per mile equivalent to the average tax per mile paid by those with gas cars, then multiplied by how much heavier their car is compared to normal cars. Now, I'd probably exempt hybrids since they typically have smallish batteries, but maybe cars at a certain battery weight and above need to pay a mileage tax. Now, why would we never do this? Because we can do nothing to deter people from transitioning to EVs, for they will save the planet from the evils of humanity. But if we truly believed in fairness or equity, we'd make the owners of those cars which cause more damage pay for the damage they cause, right? Specifically in California, drivers pay about 61 cents per gallon in state taxes. Say you average 25 miles per gallon. That equates to a mileage tax of about 2.5 cents per mile. If you drive 15,000 miles per year, that equates to $375 in gas tax per year. It's not a huge amount, but who among us would misplace $375 and not have a little freak out about not being able to find it? If you drive, say, a Tesla, which could weigh double that of a normal comparable car, well, they should pay a mileage tax of about 5 cents per mile. That would be fair. But that's not what they're going to do. Our illustrious public servants would create a standard mileage tax. I could see them making it progressive based on income. That would wind up penalizing people like farmers who typically live out and away from cities, requiring them to drive more in order to do business in whatever city. That's one of the objections. Another objection is that you and I both know they'd never just trust us to report our mileage and to be honest. And to be honest, they shouldn't. So they'd have to monitor our mileage, which they can do through GPS, through the OBD2 port, or other means. Well, that raises eyebrows regarding privacy. So we're not sure exactly what will happen going forward, but what we can be sure of is that whatever it is, our government will absolutely screw it up completely and make life worse for everyone, especially those in the middle and lower classes, because that's what they always do. Speaking of which, this would absolutely have to come after an EV mandate. California has already made it illegal to purchase gas-powered lawn and garden equipment inside of state lines. If you want a gas-powered mower, you need to head out of state and bring it back in with you. All you can find in the state are battery mowers, battery blowers, battery trimmers, etc. If the state enacts a mileage tax, a small chunk of the incentive to purchase an EV would disappear. If the incentive disappears, then they're relying on the fear-based psychological manipulation campaign that they've pushed onto the citizenry regarding so-called climate change, or people buying EVs because they're still kind of unique and cool. And if you don't think they'll turn around and mandate EVs the first chance they get, you, my friend, are sorely mistaken. But California, always thinking, always wanting to save the planet, has another idea. This idea will definitely save the climate, or at least keep the vehicular child-murdering emissions at a stable level. California is thinking they should be able to tell you what tires you can buy for your car. That's their idea. And what a great idea it is, right? They're pitching the idea that by enacting strict government controls, like a communist state, they'll be saving you money. Remember how we all scoffed at Obama when he said that we could keep our doctor and the average savings on healthcare would be $2,500 a year? Yeah, we just laughed at that, and clearly that all panned out just as he claimed. So what's their angle on this one? Well, per their proposal, Replacement Tire Efficiency Program proposal, they'd literally increase your gas mileage, lower your emissions, and ultimately save us money. I mean, wow, they give and they give and they give and never get the credit for how they're literally saving our lives every single day. Now, their proposal, in short, is to force us to only replace our tires with the original equipment tires that the car came with when it was new. The premise is that those tires are the best tires for the vehicle and the most fuel-efficient tires for that car or truck. But that's stupid. I used to work in the tire industry. We made both OEM and aftermarket tires. We made name brand tires, and we made tires with names nobody has ever heard of. I can tell you with absolute assurance the OEM spec tire, it's not always the best tire that a company offers. It's not even always the best tire for the car. They are a cost-efficient tire. Read that as probably moving into the cheapest tires possible within at least a certain boundary, and they have to, of course, meet the speed and wear and load rating that the vehicle manufacturer requires. They don't offer the best ride typically. They don't offer the best wear life typically. They don't offer the quietest ride typically. And they absolutely don't offer the best gas mileage typically. But that kind of information and those sorts of facts don't really matter to a government or a person that's more interested in power and control than they are the alleged climate problem. That isn't a problem at all, really. The climate's doing, it's fine. It's fine. It's lies built on lies. But, found on cbtnews.com, headline, California wants to decide what tires you can buy. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah, that's a good title. Our author, automotive expert and journalist, says, quote, supporters of the proposal frame replacement tires as a problem that needs government intervention. California argues that many replacement tires are less energy efficient than the original equipment tires that came on a vehicle, causing drivers to spend more on fuel. Regulators claim consumers are leaving money on the table because they aren't choosing the most efficient tires available. Now, the author, Lauren Fix, she follows up with, quote, there's just one problem with that argument. That's not how the real world works. But that's the problem, isn't it? People care less and less these days about how the real world works. They care more and more about how they feel about something. She then goes on to present her arguments, which sound strangely familiar. 1, regulators assume the OEM tire is the best, most efficient tire for your car, but that's not why auto manufacturers choose the tire they do. Tires could be chosen for many reasons. Being the most fuel-efficient tire is likely not one of them. She states that sometimes the OEM tire is great, other times it's a joke, and that fact is why the aftermarket tire market exists. Second, regulators assume fuel efficiency is not only the most important factor, but that the consumer agrees with them. And spoiler alert, that's not always, and I'd argue rarely, is the most important thing on the consumer's mind. And 3, consumers have specific needs. Some for wet traction, some for snow, some for track racing, etc. And she sums up the real problem with this, quote, "That's why this debate isn't really about tires. It's about who gets to make decisions." And that statement kind of sums it up like I said. All the regulations we've had, continue to have, and will have thrust upon us, that's why that's being done. You can think of the emission standards and the stupid diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF. You can think of the debate between raw and pasteurized milk. What about having to get a permit if you want to put a small shed in your own yard? What about vehicle inspections? And what's your argument against all this? Well, Dan, and let me stop you right there, that's Mr. Irwin to you. Well, Dan, you say, they're doing this for our safety. To which I have to push back just a bit and say, are they? Are they really? See, there was a time when milk wasn't pasteurized. There was a time when we knew how to keep up with the general maintenance and safety of our own vehicles. There was a time that we didn't need DEF, and there was a time when nobody asked anybody if they could do something on their own property. Now think about the COVID era, which, although it was a number of years ago already, it's still fresh in pretty much all of our minds. It's a wound that may be somewhat scarred over by now, but it's still tender to the touch, and it should be. That was the biggest grasp for control of mankind we've ever seen, and possibly the largest power grab across the majority of the world ever. And this brings us back to the debate of what exactly did Paul mean when he wrote in what is now Romans chapter 13, quote, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist have been appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists that authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword in vain. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of that wrath, but also because of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." Now, there's no debate, at least in my mind, that everyone in authority, or not in authority, is in their position because God put them there. I think it's also clear that those in power are there as a blessing, or a judgment, from God. And no, political affiliation has no bearing on which one of those we're experiencing at the time. And then Paul says that if we resist the authority, we're opposing the ordinance of God, and will receive condemnation. So who is that condemnation from? Well, in no way could that be condemnation from God, at least not damnation. We have examples from the Bible where various individuals, blessed by God, resisted the authorities prior to being blessed by God. We also know that this isn't a blanket black or white kind of statement, as this statement is usually caveated by saying that the only times we can defy those in authority is when they command us to do something the Bible forbids, or forbid us from doing something the Bible commands. If you follow me through our extended look at the Heidelberg Catechism, you'll know that I have come to the conclusion that at least in some cases, intent and context really does matter. Continuing on through the passage, after Paul says that the governing authorities are put there by God, that if we resist them, we oppose the ordinance of God and will incur condemnation, he says, quote, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil." So, what does Paul mean by good and evil? Well, that could mean our earthly view of good and evil. It could mean God's definition of good and evil, or it could mean obedience and disobedience. And I think that's where I have to look at context and intent. Paul goes on to say that if we don't do good, we should fear the authorities who wield the sword of justice for those who do evil. Then the example Paul uses is taxes and customs, which is our money, and fear and honor, which is our respect. But what happens when the authorities, who are put there by God, no argument for me there, are not ruling in a manner that's considered good by human standards or God's standards? And that's where I have the question. And we're always told that at the time of Paul, the Christians were under severe oppression, etc., and that may be true. But again, this clearly doesn't mean blind obedience, since we caveat the passages I just mentioned. We could also make the argument that most of our governing authorities these days are not ruling according to God's definition of good, and they're not ruling according to man's definition of good, and they're not governing according to the general concept of justice. And in a growing number of instances, they're not even governing according to the law as written. So where do we then fall with regard to emissions, mileage, tires, or for that matter, any of the clearly counter-biblical stances, policies, and laws that are being thrust upon us? Well, again, context and intent. Should we fight against DEF, DEF? Well, yeah, but we have a political system that allows for that, if followed as written. I don't think we should just revolt against it or our government over DEF or tire choice or vehicle emissions, although I get it. What about forced societal lockdowns or compulsory masking or mandatory injections? It feels like those are times we should fight, but again, through the legal system, even now, though we definitely see our judicial system crumbling around us. I do believe there are times when we must use force to resist our government. I'd cite the Revolution and the Civil War as a few of those examples. Is that opposing God? Well, I know that just as much as God is in control of who the leader, the king, or president respectively is, God is also absolutely in control of those who decide enough is enough. Diplomacy has failed, compromise has failed, judicial means have failed, legislation has failed. It's time to put a stop to whatever wrong or injustice is in question. I don't believe that what we've discussed in this segment has risen to the ranks of revolution, but I do believe that we're getting closer, not from a single thing, however. Although I'd argue that something like abortion, mutilation of our children, assisted suicide, unrestrained, and actually encouraged child trafficking and sexual abuse, and the list goes on, each in and of themselves is enough to say a line has been crossed that shall never be crossed, and now is the time to fight. But the reality is that we're just not a slavery society anymore. We're not going to have a Civil War II or Civil War 11, as Minnesota Representative and notorious brother marrier Ilhan Omar would have said. We're just not going to have a Civil War II over a single issue anymore. But the culmination of these issues, are they leading to a civil war, another revolution? Yeah, I have absolutely zero doubt that that's where we're heading. The only real question is, when? I don't personally think we're on the cusp, although I guess that would depend on your definition of cusp, wouldn't it? Once again, acknowledging that the heart of the king is water in the hands of God, and God can turn and twist it any way he'd like. Acknowledging that God is absolutely sovereign, raising up kings, deposing kings, causing nations to rise in power, causing them to be defeated in battle or crumble from within. Acknowledging that God has demonstrated that he could turn his wrathful judgment away from a nation that repents and turns back to him if he so chooses. I don't think anyone would argue that the current trajectory of our nation is not good. I don't think that anyone would argue that the gulf between those professing salvation and those who want nothing to do with God is widening at an alarming pace. If the trajectory continues, there are only two choices: collapse from within and become yet another failed socialist state, or some form of internal conflict that ends with either one side defeated in battle or both sides coming to a peaceful separation. Governments are instituted to protect humanity from evil. They're there to facilitate the furtherance of humanity. They have some very specific roles regarding societal infrastructure and protection. When they go rogue, when they start to regulate everything, when they show us their true colors, we should take notice. And we could, and from time to time, we must take action. All that being said, Regardless of what idiocy our government does, regardless of the frustrations of regulations, regardless of the limitations on our freedoms, keep in mind that God is not only a God of perfect mercy, grace, and love, He's also a God of perfect justice and vengeance is for God to dole out perfectly, righteously, and justly. His vengeance may be through yet another revolution. It may be through the destruction of our country as we know it. It may not be. It could be soon. It may not be. As I've said so many times before on here, please remember, God's plans are perfect, not just really good. They're perfect. There have been a number of times when I've said that although I feel that my plan in a specific situation would be much better than God's plan, at least in the moment, per my desires and feelings, I know that just because at that specific moment I'd feel much better about the change in plans and the momentary outcome, my plans are infinitely worse than God's plans. And that's an infinitely wild understatement. And that's what we need to ultimately rest in the large things and the small. We have the means to petition our government and advocate for much-needed change, and we have the right to do so. We have the right to complain about losses of freedom, about the burden of regulation, about the abject waste, fraud, abuse, and stupidity that takes place in the corrupt halls of government. Respecting the authority of those God placed in charge does not mean we can't work within our governmental system to make changes, replace leaders, and fight, with quotes around it, for our freedoms and liberties. But in all things, we must remember that God is in charge. There is no ruler, no law, no regulation, nothing that's a surprise to God. Not only does He know about it, He ordained it to be. We know that no matter how petty or egregious the issue, God ordained it to be from before creation. And we further know that God loves those who are His, that God's enemies will be crushed beneath His foot in the end, and that He will enact perfect, just vengeance on those who hate Him and His children. So hang in there, fellow Christian conservative, annoyed to no end by what we see coming out of our state and federal governments and agencies, bombarded with vile messaging about how you and your magical sky god are the problem. No, God's got this. God's got you. Fight for your freedom. Place your faith solely in God alone. Well, here we are, books and stuff. Reading like a bunch of nerds. Or maybe you're not reading. Maybe I'm the nerd. Well, not maybe, as I think it's pretty clear that the nerdiosity level on this side of the podcast is pretty high. Anyway, whatever. You've stumbled and staggered your way to Danny's book review, Installment 18. Sort of, on the Logical Christian Podcast. I say sort of because here's the deal. A few episodes back, I said we were on Installment 19 of Danny's book review. But I discovered later that that's not how math works, because the installment prior to 19 was 17. So, unless we're counting by twos, and nobody counts by twos using the odd numbers because that's hard. I missed 18. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's where the OCD kicks in, and although they'll be out of order, I'd rather have the correct number of installments tied to the correct number of the segments. Unfortunately, whenever the next installment drops, it'll have to be 20, hopefully I remember, in order to get us back on track. You don't care about any of this. I totally understand, but I had to tell you because that's the kind of guy I am. Okay, now that that's out of the way, on to the show. I've got 2 books to review in this segment. Sort of. A lot of sort ofs in this segment. So our latest men's discipleship group at church had us read through a book by an author I just personally don't care for. Now, I know a lot of people love his preaching, his writing, etc., but I am not one of those people. The author in question is John Piper. As an unashamed Calvinist, I should like Piper, but I just don't care for him. Reading this book, the only Piper book I've ever read, really didn't affect my opinion in either direction, necessarily. Let me explain, somewhat briefly, some of my reasoning behind my dislike for Piper. And please don't take this to mean I'm questioning his salvation. I'm not. Or his love for God, the Bible, the gospel, or those who are saved and those who are not. Because I'm not doing that either. I'm also not trying to throw anyone who likes Piper under the bus, nor am I condemning pastors and theologians for quoting Piper. Now, on a personal preference level, I just don't care for his writing style that much, or his preaching style, or, and I know this sounds petty, but even his voice. Now, admittedly, it's totally subjective. I'm sure there are more people than not who hate my voice, including me. I get it. But that's one issue I have with him, just his style. That's neither here nor there, however. Now look, I've got a few issues from over the last about 15 years or so that I simply can't overlook, and it taints him for me. So 15 years ago, Piper held his annual Desiring God Pastors Conference. One of the people he invited was Francis Chan. You may or may not know who Chan is, but if you have a kid in his his or her, late teens to probably late 20s or so, and you've been a regular on the church scene, you've likely heard of him. He's a bald-headed Asian dude. Really made his mark by addressing the youth. He's written a number of books. He has a number of video series, etc. His most popular book is entitled Crazy Love, published in 2015, which apparently speaks on understanding God. No idea. Not really interested in reading that one. Francis Chan, back in 2011, was generally speaking your typical non-denominational youth pastorish kind of guy stuff, right? But he was definitely up and coming. So he was invited to this pastors conference. He wound up being an embarrassment. He admittedly had no idea why he was sharing the stage with the other prominent pastors who had been invited. Yeah, no kidding. He didn't know answers to questions that were being asked of him during the Q&A, and he just kind of made up and fumfered his way through. Now today, Chan has moved fairly solidly into the ecumenical camp, believing that at least some non-Christian religions, like take Catholicism, will make it to heaven. Now, should Piper have seen these issues? Well, look, the first time I listened to Chan, I had some serious questions about him. My concern was to the point that I contacted our youth leader at the time to ask her, why was she showing the kids a Francis Chan video series? And I asked her to stop and explained why. She didn't, but that's a different story. Piper should have been able to peer through the fog and have at least a good idea of who this guy really was. He either didn't or couldn't. I'm not sure which. Also in 2011, during the Desiring God Pastors Conference, Piper did an interview of Rick Warren, specifically critiquing, quote unquote, his uber popular book, The Purpose-Driven Life. Warren was then and is now, at best, a wolf. Admittedly, he's gotten quite a bit worse over the years, or maybe more obvious. But again, Piper, considered to be a rock-solid theologian and pastor, should have been able to discern Warren, and in my opinion, should have never given him a platform to speak on any topic. But Piper had a mission to try to act like a life preserver to Warren's drowning man. He stated in an article on his own site preceding the interview that his, quote, aim in this interview is to bring out and clarify what Rick Warren believes about these biblical doctrines. In doing this, my hope is that the thousands of pastors and lay people who look to Rick for inspiration and wisdom will see the profound place that doctrine has in his mind and heart. Okay, well, look, Warren is a charlatan. Piper, because of his, everyone should play nice philosophy, apparently, and his why can't we all just get along attitude, wanted to smooth things over so that there wasn't an active division in what he envisions as the corporate church body. Now, along the same lines, John Piper is an interesting mix of Calvinist and continuationist. A continuationist is a person who believes the miraculous sign gifts that we see in the Bible, such as healing, speaking in tongues, raising from the dead, and so on, are still in effect today and happen on a fairly regular basis and are called down from heaven by whichever person has enough faith, the pastor, the so-called apostle, etc. Now, this is opposed to the cessationist view that the miraculous sign gifts ended with the death of the Apostle John and possibly sooner. We absolutely believe in the miracle of healing, but that's for God to decide, not for us to call down from on high. We believe that God will heal. We ask God to heal, but we know God is sovereign, and that one, we don't have the ability or power to force God to heal. And two, we know that God's plan is ultimately infinitely better than anything we may request at the time. So these two positions are clearly in direct opposition to each other. I believe the cessationist view is the correct view, but this can invoke some very negative, nasty responses by saying that. I also believe that there isn't a right or wrong view with regard to salvation. You don't have to be one or the other in order to be a Christian. Now, all that said, back in 2010, Piper was asked if he had ever been given a vision by God or spoken in tongues. And he makes it very clear that he's prayed and prayed and prayed for God to grant him the gift of speaking in tongues. But nothing yet. Piper is too good of a theologian to believe in the sign gifts. And yet, look, I do know what I just said about the two views, but come on. I mean, John, come on. I do believe that I hope that Piper is thinking of tongues as what's described in the Bible, the ability to speak to and or be understood by those who speak a language, a real language, a language Piper has never been trained in. But I'd like to think he'd be much more discerning about expressing his desire to speak in tongues, as these days all that does is serve to embolden those who are simply babbling incoherently and calling it tongues. That said, since the term has been hijacked by the crazy charismatic wing, I think it's valid to have concerns over Piper cozying up next to the cessationist line. Another thing that really makes me dislike Piper, and I mean really dislike Piper, is his view on creation. A chapter in this book that I still haven't given you the title for speaks on God and creation. Some of his language made me wonder what exactly his view was on creation versus evolution, so I looked it up. And at best, he's kind of a non-committal, wishy-washy on creation as a whole kind of guy. He's very sure that Adam and Eve were created, and I have to put that in quotes, between 6,000 and 15,000 years ago. But other than that, he's pretty loosey-goosey on creation in terms of when, in terms of how long a day was, and things like that. So he appears to be one of those Christians who lives kind of in the mushy middle of theistic evolution. Oh, look, I think if you read the Bible and come to the conclusion that the earth is older than, say, 10,000 years, generally rounding, you're not able to read the Bible correctly. The plain reading of the Bible using basic rules of Hebrew and Greek could never yield a confused answer of millions of years and untold death and destruction prior to getting Adam on the scene. Furthermore, with Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and the Institute for Creation Research out there, among others, for Piper to not understand at least the basic theological contradictions and the implications of a long age of creation, well, it shows he's got a severe lack of understanding of the text of the Bible, at least in that respect. And that's a major problem for me, as it should be for all Christians. And I think what really probably snapped that very last frayed strand of the rope for me was his disdain for Donald Trump and how he was working hard to claim that a Christian didn't have to vote for Trump in 2020. Now look, don't get me wrong, it wasn't because of Trump the person and what he thought that irritated me. It was because of Piper's disdain for Trump and his supposed justification in voting for someone other than Trump or Biden. Look, it is our right to vote who we want to vote for. In 2016, I voted for Evan McMullen or whatever. But in the bright red state in which I live, I knew my vote would not determine the electoral votes of the state. What Piper did, however, was use his burgeoning Trump derangement syndrome to free people to go vote for whoever or not to vote at all. Now, I'll fully admit that Trump is not a Christian. He's not really a moral man. He likely has questionable ethics. But the alternative was Biden. No third party was ever going to win. That's foolishness to think so. Hopefully one day that can happen. It's not going to be these days here. It was going to be one or the other, Biden or Trump. And by telling Christians who overwhelmingly vote red that they were justified either in not voting for Trump or not voting at all, you're casting a de facto vote for whoever eventually wins. And the one who eventually won was President Potato. And please don't hear this as me saying you must vote Republican to be a Christian. I do believe that if you vote Democrat, you are not a Christian. You can't vote for abject evil, the stuff the Democrats stand for, and claim salvation at the same time. If you think I'm wrong, help me make it make sense. You can't square that circle. Now, I am saying that the Republican view, even as bad as it is today, is still the most aligned with Christian principles. And to vote for the left or abstain from voting, doing your job as a citizen, you're handing the election to absolute demonic evil. Piper was even called out by evangelicals across the nation, including Franklin Graham, for his boneheaded, TDS-fueled justification in allowing Biden the victory. Okay, I think I've made it pretty clear why I'm not a Piper fan. Now, all that said, Piper will go down as one of the great theologians of our age, or probably any age. And I think probably rightly so. The insight he has into Scripture, the wisdom he has imparted to so many, is inestimable. Now, I can fully understand why so many people absolutely love John Piper, and I can't fault them for it. I just think, as I do with all pastors and theologians, that we need to be very careful, very discerning with Piper, and I guess with what Piper's saying. Personally, knowing the things I just mentioned a few moments ago, I don't have any desire to read or listen to Piper, nor will I recommend Piper to anyone in general conversation. I have much better theologians to recommend to someone if they were to ask. Now, the books I'll be briefly reviewing, as I know I've already rambled on too long in this segment, are entitled, first, The Pleasures of God, and second, Does God Desire All to be Saved? The second book is fairly short, only 54 pages, and it's actually an expansion of what was, I think, mostly the epilogue in the first book, and maybe a little bit of a few of the chapters. Now, starting with The Pleasures of God, this is a 250-plus page book with a 25-plus page study guide if you're so inclined. His overall aim of this book is to point out that God isn't the old, curmudgeonly man, long white beard, sitting on his throne, slightly hunched over, looking over the edge of heaven with a thunderbolt in his hand, ready to strike any and every Christian who isn't perfect. He wants us to understand that God has delight. He takes delight in so many things, his Son, his creation, his gospel, his salvation, etc. And I'll be honest, Piper does a really good job of doing exactly that. So, he covers 9 areas God takes pleasure in: his Son, all he does, his creation, his fame, election, bruising his Son, doing good to all who hope in him, prayers of the upright, and personal obedience and public justice. This covers all aspects of who God is, who Jesus is, and who we are as part of his creation. Now, Piper is famously long-winded. He tends to ramble, and yes, before you make a comment, I can identify. There were times in the book where it felt like he was telling a personal anecdote because he had a contractual number of pages to be written and he needed filler. But although that seems to be true, there were also excellent insights and pearls of wisdom in each of the chapters, and of that there's no doubt. I mean, I can't argue that. He continually stresses that God is not an angry God. He's actually a happy, joy-filled, singing, exuberant God. He desires to be praised and worshiped. He desires to do and give good things to his children. He desires his children seeking him diligently in prayer. Now, Piper wants us to change the view that I'd argue the majority of Christians have, a stuffy old, get off my lawn kind of God. And Piper does an excellent job of doing just that. He states very early in chapter 1, quote, "A great part of God's glory is his happiness. God's glory consists much in the fact that he is happy beyond our wildest imagination." Is that how we view God? I mean, I would argue probably not. He states in chapter 2, quote, "God does what he does not begrudgingly or under external constraint as though he were boxed in or trapped by some unforeseen or unplanned situation. His deeds are the overflow of his joy." He hits on some controversial but biblically accurate ideas such as, quote, "All the sins of man and machinations of Satan ultimately have to enhance the glory and kingdom of our Savior." A lot of people don't like that idea. They want to divorce God from anything they perceive as negative in this world. But to do that literally robs God of his sovereignty over all of creation and stands in stark contrast to the Bible as written. He gives a very good explanation of a few of the supposed contradictions in the Bible, the first being that God desires all to be saved, yet God elects only some to salvation, and the other being that God is grieved by the death of the wicked while at the same time pleased by the death of the wicked. Now, these are not contradictions. Spoiler alert, these may be difficult to understand. They may even be considered a paradox, but these are not contradictions. And Piper does an excellent job explaining what the Bible says on these subjects. More on that with my review of book number 2, sort of. He sums up chapter 2 with what I think is one of the best sentences in the book. Quote, "I do not need to explain everything. That he reigns and that he loves is enough for now." Now let that sink in. Rewind that, listen to it again. In all of your situations, good or bad, through your trials and turmoil, through exuberant joy and crippling grief, we don't need to explain, and we don't need an explanation for everything. We simply need to know that God reigns and God loves, and that's all. And that's enough. Skipping ahead to chapter 7, God taking pleasure in doing good to all who hope in him, Piper states, quote, "God loves to show mercy. His anger must be released by a stiff safety lock, but his mercy has a hair trigger." Now, Piper throughout makes it very clear that God has no need for us. Rather, we need him. He is infinitely satisfied in himself in the communion of the Trinity. This is vital to understand, lest we think of ourselves as some way we shouldn't, and as of God in a way we shouldn't. He also makes it clear throughout that God doesn't require us to do. He isn't looking at our works to please him. Rather, his pleasure comes when we admit that we can't do, that we need him, that we hope in him, that we require him. It's an acknowledgement of who God is when we place our hope in him. Put simply, quote, "God is the kind of God who will be pleased with the one thing I have to offer, my thirst." In chapter 8, speaking of prayer, Piper makes what I think constitutes his most controversial, yet theologically accurate argument for the doctrine of election and the concept of free will in relation to prayer. Now, I'll try to sum it up fairly briefly, a couple longer quotes in here. The bottom line is that if we don't believe that God is sovereign in all things, including election to salvation, his sovereign choice of who will be saved and who won't, then we should stop praying for God to save people. Now, that sounds almost blasphemous, but he makes his point, and once again, I'll lay the challenge down: find a fault with the logic. If you don't believe in the doctrine of election, if you're an Arminian, as I'd argue most of Christendom is today, as most of my family and friends are, that means that you don't believe in God's sovereign power in election and conversion of lost sinners. Rather, you believe that God can offer, can plead, can beg, but that he's too much of a gentleman God, I've heard that quote, to ever impose his will on others. Now, if that's the case, then you have no right to pray that God replaces the stony heart of someone, replacing it with a heart of flesh. You have no right to pray that God turns someone's heart to him. You can't pray that God causes someone to walk in his ways. You can't pray that God brings someone to a point of repentance and faith, and you can't pray that God opens the eyes of someone who's lost. And why? Well, because you believe that God would not take away the free will of man to choose, so how much influence could God have in any of those requests before it flipped to God imposing his will over man's? To sum up this problem, Piper asks, quote, "Why is it right for God to cause a person to think a question, and wrong for God to cause that person to think an answer?" He says, quote, "If it is legitimate for God to plant a longing in a person's heart, how strong can the longing be that God chooses to plant? One kind of longing is so strong that it leads the person to pursue and embrace Christ. The other kind of longing is not strong enough to lead a person to embrace Christ. Which should we pray for? If we pray for the strong longing, then we are praying that the Lord would work effectually and get that person saved. If you pray for the weak longing, then we are praying for an ineffectual longing that leaves the person in sin, but preserves his self-determination. People who really believe that man must have the ultimate power of self-determination can't consistently pray that God would convert unbelieving sinners, because if they pray for divine influence in a sinner's life, they are either praying for a successful influence, which takes away the sinner's ultimate self-determination, or they are praying for an unsuccessful influence, which is not praying for God to convert the sinner. So either you give up praying for God to convert sinners, or you give up ultimate human self-determination. Again, I ask you to find the flaw in the logic and to support that finding biblically. I'll wait. I maintain that you can do neither. So please explain to me again how you hold to your unsupportable, unjustifiable, unbiblical view of free will. He wraps up his book with some pithy statements, one of which, quote, "The command to obey is the command to be happy in God is only as hard to obey as the promises of God are hard to believe." He speaks about how God's goodness to us does not depend on our greatness. Rather, it's quite simply God's pleasure to give us the entire kingdom. And he wraps up the book with this, quote, "This is the soul's end, the blessing beyond which no better can be imagined or conceived, an infinite, eternal, mutual, holy energy of love and pleasure between God the Father and God the Son, flowing out in the person of God the Spirit and filling the souls of the redeemed with immeasurable and everlasting joy." If you're saved, you're the recipient of that flow. And this rolls us into book 2, Does God Desire All to Be Saved? So this short book expands the concept of election, giving a very good explainer on the alleged contradiction that God's will is that all are saved, while at the same time God has elected only some to salvation. His aim in this short book is to show, using multiple examples from Scripture, that both of those can be true, that they do not contradict each other, as there's no contradiction in God. And this can all be summed up understanding that God does not always will that which he desires. Now, when I step back and thought about that phrase, the idea that God would automatically will what he desires is an overtly human trait. If I desired something and I had the power to make that desire come true, I would do it 100% of the time. I'd do it more than that if it were possible. But God isn't a being driven by the emotion of want. He's God. So although he may desire one thing, he also knows that to fulfill that desire and to make it come to fruition, that would actually result in a much worse outcome overall. So just because he desires something doesn't mean that he wills it. We're talking God's sovereignty here. Some examples. The death of his son. God absolutely willed that act of the worst sin and evil possible to happen, while strictly forbidding sin. God wills to harden the hearts of some men, while commanding us to not sin, to come to him. Jesus told us why he spoke in parables, because if he didn't, if he spoke plainly, the Pharisees and others would understand what he was saying, and they would turn and be saved. But although his desire is for them to be saved, his will is that they are not. God hates evil and wickedness, and when a secular ruler refrains from doing evil, it's because God ordained it. And when the ruler decides to perpetrate evil, it's because God ordained it. This is illustrative of the phrase, God uses sin sinlessly. It's all for God's glory. Quoting Jonathan Edwards, quote, "It implies no contradiction to suppose that an act may be an evil act, and yet that it is a good thing that such an act should come to pass." Piper speaks on free will, God and sin, God's will, the ultimate, intermediate, and effectual actors when it comes to sin and so on. He quotes John Calvin, quote, "In a wonderful and ineffable manner, nothing is done without God's will, not even that which is against his will." Skip back 10 seconds on this one and let that phrase rattle around in your head. Now, after 53 pages of claims, arguments, and biblical answers, Piper sums up the idea of free will with this, quote, "I do not find in the Bible that human beings have the ultimate power of self-determination. As far as I can tell, this is a philosophical presupposition brought to the Bible rather than found in it." And he's exactly correct. So, does God desire all to be saved? Yes, he does. Does he elect all to salvation? Not even close. His desire and his effectual will do not have to move lockstep in a singular direction. God can desire something while ordaining something else. Okay, with that, we've reached the point in our segment of Danny's book review where I tell you if I recommend the book or not. Remember what I said about Piper? Working back to front. Look, I would absolutely recommend Does God Desire All to Be Saved? This is a compact book, very fast read. It will challenge your view of God's sovereignty and salvation. Whether you fall into the Calvinist camp or the Arminian, this short book will present biblically grounded arguments that you should, as a Christian, wrestle with. To not do so, well, frankly, it's kind of lazy. Now, would I recommend the first book, The Pleasures of God? I wouldn't be mad at you for reading it. I wasn't mad at reading it myself, I guess. In both books, Piper brought out biblically grounded, theologically accurate points and arguments that I had never heard of, but I'm glad I heard them now. I think that any Christian would benefit by reading these books, and although you could buy them off Amazon or wherever, one thing I really do appreciate about Piper is that his site makes his materials available free of charge. So you can go to his site and download the content in a PDF and read it on your computer or phone or whatever, or just print it and read it. I'll put a link to Amazon and to his site in the show notes. Now, all that said, do I recommend Piper? And the answer is, personally, I wouldn't. For me, he's been acquiring too much baggage over the last 15 years. I don't want to have to read his books, constantly trying to tell myself to watch out for anything goofy or worse. If you like Piper, look, I totally get that. Totally understand. Personally, he's not my cup of tea, and that's also okay. So I guess with that, take from this lengthy review what you will. Choose for yourself, out of your own free will, with the understanding that God is ultimately in absolute control over you and all things. If you want to read either of these books or not, I say you should. You choose. Now, as always, get up, get off your duff, and go read something. Well, we've reached the end of this episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I know, I'm not happy about it either. If you found value in this podcast, like, rate, review, and share if you wouldn't mind. Don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Against logic, there is no armor like ignorance. Lawrence J. Peter. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.